Well, welcome. Here we are, our sacred conversation number 3. I'm so excited. Until we spoke just recently, I didn't realize I've been living my life by this principle from the outside in and the inside out. So we're talking about resourcing today.
Yeah, and I just want to start by thanking y'all for joining us on Denie, Shae, and I just have this commitment to offering something monthly to all of our community. And one of the fun topics we came up with is what we call sacred conversations, where she and I just dialogue about themes and uh, ideas, inspirations that are important to us and that we want to unpack for everyone a little bit. And so resourcing it is this month in our sacred conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's dive in with that, Denie, Shae. I want to know how long you've been being intentional about resourcing.
Well, I would say I didn't realize it was resourcing until a little later, but I think I started really resourcing back in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
And that for me initially began with finding essential oils to manage anxiety. Little did I know the anxiety was pointing to something a lot larger. And then I would get introduced to other things that were very resourcing based that would continue to help me nourish and really reconnect with myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll save a little bit about my personal story when we talk about our inner resource, but 2012 it began, and I would say very seriously in 2014 by seeking the help of an Ayurvedic and herbalist practitioner in my area, and that became a really big lifestyle shift.
Mm-hmm.
And then as I got introduced to iRest and yoga nidra and that form of meditation and the inner resource, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it kind of deepened that, and I really understood maybe what resourcing was. And I knew that I was doing some intentional things in my lifestyle to bring in this feeling of nourishment and well-being and really support and comfort.
Mm-hmm.
So 2012 is when it started, and here I am, 2020.
8 years later.
Yeah.
That's a long enough time to have a baseline or start to build a somatic baseline of equanimity and well-being I hear you using that word a lot.
Yes.
So, and I know we have so much to cover, but I'm having another question pop in.
Yeah.
So for you, when you think of resourcing or feeling your resource, it relates to what other words would you use for that feeling? I heard you used well-being a lot.
Yes.
Something else. Yeah.
Yes, and I think sometimes as teachers we will use blanket terms in order not to maybe scare or shock certain people that don't have similar feelings like we do. If I'm being quite honest, this deep feeling of well-being for me actually comes online as a stillness. But for some, if I said stillness, that might be really agitating. So yeah, I guess I was using well-being as kind of a blanket term, but there's definitely a quieting, a stilling. There's kind of a sense of void simultaneously with the feeling of belonging. Like everything empties out, but there's a deep ground that is supporting that emptying out. So me being more of an anxious type might seem anxious in that moment, but it actually feels really deeply okay.
I hear you. I hear supportive.
What about you? Do you have certain, other than well-being, what's your pointer words or feelers?
Definitely ground and rest. And it always, for me, or most of the time, maybe not always, has a downward and inward feeling. Because also as a Vata type who tends more towards anxiety, that feeling of sort of nesting or resting down in myself, like actually landing in my body, being connected to the earthen aspect of both my own physicality and the earth or nature around me. Ground and rest are terms that point me to the feeling that I am looking for.
I love that ground and and rest. And I like that you point to us enjoying that we have Vata energy, we can create and play together, but we recognize that we might live a bit up here in our energy bodies, which can be really fun, but might not always be sustainable, especially for lengthy periods of time. And so sometimes I see really strong meditators or Kundalini practitioners kind of increasing their Vata slowly over time, but maybe the container or the ojas isn't simultaneously building. So even though the practices are really lovely, everything is just bubbling up, 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 and that sense of needing a ground for that to rise up from and return to is so important. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you, in the sense that until I encountered IREST and the term inner resource, I didn't know what I was already trying to do or attempt through things like going for a walk at sunset or my yoga practice. I always felt noticeably different after taking or teaching a yoga class, but I didn't know that what I was doing was finding the place in myself that I would call a resource. And really, that's a broad psychological term. So for those of you who are live, you know, and those of you who aren't may not know that Denie, Shae, and I are both certified IREST teachers. And IREST is a 10-step yoga nidra meditation protocol. And one of the steps, one of the foundational pieces is what we call the inner resource. So learning about that specific tool, which makes sense because the whole protocol was developed by a psychologist, right, and a meditation teacher. It makes sense that, you know, the term is used, but yes, we're talking about something very specific when we talk about resourcing. Yeah. That's used broadly across, you know, the field of mental health. Yeah.
Yeah, I see that word popping up quite a bit, especially now with our need for resiliency, really, in times that are a bit precarious.
Yeah, so, you know, if we unpack the word itself, resourcing just a bit, and what it means at a psychological place, I feel like what we're talking about is something dependable within the self, something like an ability to find a place of self-reliance that's stable and can be counted on and doesn't require any sort of external circumstance or person to be felt or accomplished or come into. Yeah. And then it has a very spiritual lens as well. You could look at it like we're actually accessing a part of the capital S self. We're accessing the capital S self that's unchanging, that never leaves us, that has never been hurt, has always been connected. And then, of course, in the IREST practice, and the way Denie and Shae and I teach it, and the way I think it's most effective psychologically, is for it to have a somatic aspect. That it's not a concept, it's not something you know and visualize, it's something you can feel. And it's subtle, right? Like it's not like feeling your bones or your heartbeat or your muscles. It's subtle, but it does have what we call a felt sense. Yeah.
I find that that can deepen over time. And for people that are maybe more body aware or body centric, you know, or maybe they're doing something very physical with their life every day, so they're really aware of their body, they might be able to sense that a bit stronger than others that maybe might not have such a body awareness, or those that have experienced a bit of challenge or trauma where really feeling the body is different than thinking about the body. Two very different experiences. So that felt sense of resources, that's what I love that the IREST really introduced me to, is like, oh, pay attention to how that really feels.
Right. Yeah, for me too, that the beautiful, grounded, connected feeling or thing I feel in nature, that I don't have to have nature to cultivate that felt sense within me. And then it's accessible to me anytime, anywhere, if I cultivate it as such. Yeah.
So I feel like I have like two branches of thinking right now. One is, you know, for those that aren't somatic based, or maybe, you know, maybe feeling a little distant from their body, are there other ways to access felt sense of resourcing? And I was really curious to know for you personally, if you, from the beginning, once you heard about this resourcing, if you were able to connect with that, like truly that capital S, that unchanging ground, or was that something that over time and practice you remembered?
Mhm. Love that question. By the time I encountered IRES and heard the term in resource, it was instantly available to me. But here's what I recognized is that this was a way to intentionally access something I had always thought was a spontaneous act of grace and random, because I've been a spiritual seeker my whole life. So I would have called it peace, right? Or connection with the Holy Spirit, say. And I had been cultivating that through, you know, a fundamental religious practice early in my life, and then through yoga next, which is the cultivation of union, right? But it would all remain somewhat heady, except for those random experiences where I would just experience profound peace. But I didn't realize that I could intentionally cultivate that felt sense until I rest. And that's what had me jump in with my whole self and say, yes, I want to go as far as I can with this practice and teach it. Because I realized everything that was important to me about connection with the capital S self was possible anytime, anywhere, for anyone.
That's sweet.
And IREST uses the word being, like what I've said so far in this talk is capital S self. It's just another way of saying what IREST calls being. Yeah.
Thank you. That was sweet.
But yeah, you know, the first branch you brought up, I encounter a lot with students and sometimes myself too. Like if I'm in a really intense period, to really find the somatic experience of a resource, an inner resource, is a challenge. So how do you, and I know you've encountered, you know, you've worked with trauma in yourself and with clients. So what tips do you have?
Active imagination
Mm,
and really externalizing, maybe initially. That's, I think, my Ayurvedic lifestyle and IRS began to happen really side by side, and they really supported each other back and forth, because what I was experiencing really deeply internally and from more the inside out through IREST with resourcing and turning on to, I was experiencing with my eyes open, eating, smelling, tasting, touching, hearing through different Ayurvedic practices, cleansing the senses first. So it's like removing all of the lenses that we might have added on, or the limiting thought patterns or blinders. It's like clearing it all out.
mm,
And then you're really able to see and then intentionally create lifestyle choices. Simple things like, what color do you paint your walls?
mm-hmm.
You
So
know,
I love where you're going, but for those who may not know, because I didn't know about it until I started talking to you, say a
yeah.
bit more about what you mean by externalizing.
So I like to assign sensory, you know, information to this resourcing. So I look at our five senses, the smelling, tasting, touching, hearing, and seeing. And through these five senses, you can intentionally make choices in your immediate environment, like in your home or in your workspace, how you present yourself, the clothes you wear, the words you choose, and make those choices to externalize this felt, for me, like we were saying, stillness, quiet, support, nourishment. Well, what would that look like? What would that smell like? Could my whole house really smell like a forest?
Does
Could
it?
I? This room does. This is my inner resource room. Like if my internal resource had an external room, like if I had a room with all of my favorite things,
Mm-hmm.
I have a diffuser, I have chimes, I have drums, I have paintings that I created with these vibrant colors, I have soft textures, I have a little bit of coarse texture on the floor. I have my ideal landscape. Like I'm flooding all of my senses with things that I've chosen personally for me that point me to reconnecting to my body, to quiet, to still, to feel supported.
I love that. I have a lot of room to grow in that area.
I don't know if it became so natural because my first life, I was an interior designer. So I already had this like, there's something very important about a space and what's in the space and how that influence and impacts people. So I knew early on there was something to like, what's surrounding me? It's impacting me. I felt that growing up for sure. And so now that I am living in my childhood home and I have the freedom to make this childhood home that was a white walled blank space, vata, kind of airy type of place to live, no real sense of ground. And I painted dark, rich colors, earth tones. I have smells, I have herbs. It feels different than it did growing up. It feels nourishing and supportive.
Yeah. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that what we do, with the I Rest Inner Resources, we richly elaborate an internal image with all the five senses, but it's still just an active imagination meant to invoke a feeling. But then if you take all those elaborate sensory details and transpose them into your external environment, you have a way better chance of activating that same somatic felt sense more regularly.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm sure everyone that's listening, if you're listening live or later, while we're talking, start imagining, start feeling the spontaneous things that you love that you could put into your external environment that would support you and nourish you.
And I would even take it a step further, self-inquiry wise, like maybe look around at what you have currently and just notice how it makes you feel. Like, so if you have a little bit of anxiety or depression, then you really stop to look around and notice like my environment and how I'm living and how it feels. Does that point to maybe some of what you're experiencing? And it may or may not, but again, it's just an inquiry to be curious about.
Yeah.
But I find my external very much influences my internal. So this supported that somatic feeling. So that simultaneously with the inner workings through I Rest and inner resourcing in that way really began to light up that body feeling. And now I have that. But initially in I Rest, when I started, I didn't have the felt sense of that for a couple of years.
So the cleansing of the senses becomes the literal cleansing of the things in the environment that block what you want your senses to perceive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you know what else I think is happening here for people that I just realized, I was making some notes before we talked and I noticed like, oh my gosh, I Rest in Ayurveda, the sense of reconnecting with my body and this felt sense. For people that have experienced times in their life where they felt they had no choice, you have so much choice. And it feels so empowering. And that in and of itself feels resiliency and resourceful, like you were saying, it's self-reliant.
Well, and what I would add there is it feels overwhelming to think about transposing your entire home environment. Like start with a room or start with an altar space. It can be small, but give yourself or it could be just your office, your workspace. Give yourself some little space that is a resource, an external resource, because that will then help you cultivate the feeling of the internal resource.
Absolutely. Yes.
Well, what I love about what you're saying is, I felt like in I Rest, we were really pointed to, and it's so valuable, that your internal resource is not reliant on external circumstance. So what you're saying is, yes, and I can use my external environment to support my internal experience.
Yes. And when I heard that in the first day of training and felt okay, and then they, invited, if you couldn't feel that sensation, maybe a memory and having a bit of a PTS experience, I was like, what memories? Like, I don't have that. And I felt very overwhelmed. So
Mhm.
Ayurveda coming in side by side and going, okay, but why don't we paint the walls green? Because the blue in your vata and it's cold and you're anxious, we need to give you something a bit different.
Mhm.
So yes, it shouldn't be reliant on,
Mhm.
but why not use every tool we have available to us?
Just
And
what you.
sometimes it's easier to paint a room than it is to kind of go into some of the deep PTS or some of the trauma stuff that you might be experiencing early on. Maybe the green room over time gives you the permission and the safety to kind of go into more of the internal experiences.
Mhm. Or buying plants.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Mm.
you talked about when we first started, you love nature.
Mhm.
That's kind of an immediate pointer to resourcing and being. Are there any other things, practices, tools that you find that you immediately gravitate toward naturally that also kind of evoke resourcing?
Resource me. I want to talk for nature brought up something for me. So I want to talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And then I'll see if there's anything else. But nature
Okay.
is such a big one for me. What's come to mind a lot recently is if you break down this word resource, it's re and source. So for me, it's like remembering that you are connected to source or reconnecting to source. And so much of our anxiety, if not maybe all of it, I think maybe all anxiety comes from not remembering that we're connected to a source. Like we came from somewhere. Something we can't life ourselves. Something is lifing me, just like something is lifing the tree. So nature helps me remember that I am as much connected to a source as it is, because I am also a creature of the creation. I didn't get here just by myself. I didn't figure it out how to put myself here. So when I look at a tree, I'm imagined like that. I can sense the root system
Mm.
that's drawing nutrients and water up from the earth. I can sense the interchange of gases through its leaves. I can sense the photosynthesis that's happening with the sun. I can sense this deep intelligence in something that's just so spontaneously erupting. And I have to know, I know if that has that, if that tree has that kind of connection and interchange and intelligence, I must also. And so my sense of separation dissolves when I'm in nature, because it's really arrogant for me to hold myself apart from source. And I see that. So for me, resourcing is a return to remembering and feeling in my body. I can actually, it's an embodied thing, knowing I'm connected to an intelligence, a life source, a breath, like something, a mystery that's greater than me, and letting that in. And so then that connection inspires ease and more of a sense of trust or flow. Um, so that's part of how nature, I think, is a literal resource for me. It just reminds me. I look at a duck, I look at a lake, I look at a cloud. It's also apparent to me how much a part of source all of that is. And I don't care what name you give source, right? But we're just saying it all came from somewhere. And so I must have also. It's really arrogant to think that I must not have, that I alone in all the universe am separate from that which gave me birth. So nature just pops me right back in that groove of, oh yeah, I'm part of all this. I'm part of something that's much greater than I am. And I feel that sense of ease come back into my body. Um, wow, other places that it happens, I do really enjoy moving. So, being something about moving and stretching my body. Maybe it's because the mind that creates separation comes back into connection. A bath, a nice warm salty
Oh,
bath can
Yes.
reconnect me and resource me. Right now, my child, just when I get out of my head enough to really be present to the beautiful light in his eyes, and to see him as a divine being. Yeah. Resourcing, I guess I will say another sort of continual resource for me through the years. And this, we could say this is circumstantial and not my own, but humans are communal beings, but my friends are, a call with a friend, connection with a friend, a hug, a coffee, and this time of our lives, a Zoom call, that's resourcing for me also.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Could really feel that when you're talking about nature.
Yeah.
Mm.
Similar there. And I really think just by design, all humans are similar there. We've just forgotten a lot how much of a resource that is because we've insulated ourselves with walls and air conditioning and technology, Wi-Fi and electricity and
Yeah. We used to live by the sun and the seasons, and we're much more connected to the earth, respected her, recognized the amazing gift she gives.
And science is starting to bear out actually some of the literal, if you want to, scientific ways that Earth resources us. Like earthing. We know that our electromagnetic field changes when we are in bare skin contact with the earth. We know that our blood flow and our biochemistry changes when we receive direct sunlight on the skin. We know that our biochemistry changes when we touch another being, whether it's a human or an animal or a plant.
I love that you mentioned that because my imagined inner resource initially was walking up next to a horse and touching the horse as I walked next to it. So for me, it was this real tactile feeling of touching this animal, the horse, that has always been a loving, supportive wisdom figure in my life.
Yeah.
Whether you're touching or imagining it.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so now you're pointing to the I rest, sort of the doorway into the I rest version of inner resources can be an image or a memory. And I find that this can be really helpful for students. So let's dive in a little bit with our own examples.
Yes.
So keep going with the horse. So when you bring that image into your meditation, what senses come alive?
Oh my gosh. All of a sudden, it's like this movie playing out in front of me. So I see and I smell and I touch. And like before me, I see this barn, and it's an actual place that I've been to, so I know it well. I spent a lot of time there. So I know where the hot walker is and where the turnout rink is and the barn, and it's hot and it's sunny and it smells like the wonderful horse smell. Oh, so good. But what I loved is like that transitional, and all this is coming alive in my inner resource initially. It was like so warm and sunny. And then I go into the barn and it's cool and shady. And there's so much wood, and all the horses start popping their head kind of into the interior of the barn. So they're there to greet me. There's nothing that I'm supposed to do or needs to be done. And I just sit in the interior of the barn, and it has this musty, earthy, cool, dark, contained, so I feel sheltered. And so that's what I spent the 2 years when it was Welcome the Inner Resource, that felt sense. I just saw that whole thing play out, and I could touch it and smell it and feel the different temperature changes.
So the iris in me now says, okay, so as you bring all that in, what do you notice in your body?
I get a triangulation. So I get a triangle in my palms to my heart,
Mm.
and it's warm and it's tingly. There's like an energy to it, but it's really contained and really deep and gentle. So
Mm.
it's not super active. There's a quietness to it, but there's an aliveness to it.
Mm.
Here and here.
Mm-hmm. It brings a smile to your face.
Yeah, and when now I can access the felt sense like that, and it's great too because it feels like an empowering stance. Like all of a sudden, like my arms come down and my heart
Mm.
lifts, and I feel this like triangle of energy that's like opening and like saying yes.
And the deep sigh comes up in me. Huh? My diaphragm just relaxed.
Yeah. Like, oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm.
that triangle effect just happened a couple years ago.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It was all the horse and all the barn and all that for a long, long time. There was other feelings like I could feel comfort or peace or relaxation or my breath getting deeper or my muscle tone softening, but I didn't really have this strong,
Mm.
um, just like returns me home now.
Mm.
Yeah,
That's wonderful. What
it's
a
sweet,
gift.
and it just showed up. I didn't go looking. For a while, I went looking, and the more you look, it kind of it doesn't like it's not hidden, but
And seek.
you're so contracted that you miss it sometimes
That's
in the
wonderful.
looking.
Right. Yeah, that's a perfect way of saying it. You get so contracted in the search for it that you miss it.
Well, like you said, you've had spontaneous moments of grace,
Mm-hmm.
and I knowing what I know now in this felt sense now, a lot of what I'm describing with the quiet and the still is very similar to a felt experience I had in one of the most challenging points in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So it's interesting how reflecting back, like, whoa, that's really
Mm.
always there.
And like it's something to relax back into or open up into instead of try to create.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't replace, right, what's happening. I think that's important to recognize, like all the resourcing, whether it's external or internal that I'm doing, it's not to only be in like capital self all the time, like and being in bliss or Om Hotel all the time. It's like, no, that's here too alongside my anxiety and alongside my grief and my hunger and my desires and my okayness.
Mm-hmm.
It's not here to like
Mm-mm.
put those things in a box and forget about it. It's like, no, I'm here to hold you. Come on in. We're all friends. This too shall pass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's resilient.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the willingness to be with a little bit of discomfort in the moment or a lot of discomfort in the moment
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
while simultaneously feeling held.
Yeah. Mm.
What's happening over there in you?
Oh, I was seeing my first one my strongest inner resource image through the years, the one I've used the most.
So this has been a reoccurring.
Yeah, I've had several, as you probably have, several images that have, been my portals into the feeling. Um, my most common one, though, or the one I've used most frequently that has come to me most frequently, is a place I've never been. It's imaginary, you know? Um, and I'm in sort of an open air temple. It's got a sandstone floor and sandstone walls, so it's really earthy but soft. It's not clay, it's soft and airy. And there's high walls, but open, big open windows, and even like a whole side that's open air, open to the forest that's right there. And because I'm in the temple, and sometimes I'm sitting on the floor and sometimes I'm laying on the floor of the temple, but I'm very grounded and close to the earth. But there's a sense of the sacred, or that stillness that you're talking about, that's unchanging, or we could say eternal, something beyond all this that's changing. So there's a real sense of that coming in on me, while the open air is real vitalizing and fresh and brings with it the sounds of the forest, and I can see the green of the trees. So it's like the stillness and the unchanging combined with the vibrance of life. And all of that is trickling in to my body.
Oh, that's juicy.
And I'm just laying or sitting there absorbing it. And the felt sense I noticed right away in my body is really soft tingling in my arms and legs, you know, kind of at the periphery.
Yes, it's a little diffuse.
Mm-hmm. While there's also a deep sigh at my heart and my core.
Mm.
A deep relaxing there. So I know we're getting close to our time limit, but
Yeah.
I'm curious. The question that's arising in me is, why is this important? I mean, I think we've covered that, but in this time, you know, right now, why is this important, and what can people do?
I think why this is important now is, well, I think it's important always, because in my mind, resourcing, whether it's external or internal, is a way of building resiliency, stabilizing your immune system, encouraging your digestive system to be regular. So I'm seeing all the cascading effects of this intentional resourcing in your life, whether it's sitting or lying and doing eye rest or meditation and feeling that, or painting your walls, or, you know, working with essential oils, whatever that looks like. I think now more than ever, there's a lot going on. We're bombarded with a lot of information. Some of it's really good. Some of it's confusing. A lot of it's confusing, actually. And so the idea of choice and empowerment, it's like, what do I have control over in this moment? And a lot of times it's what you're making for dinner. And, you know, what you're going to be doing with your time, your spare time, maybe not working. Like, how is that intentional? So I think it's going to keep us focused on ourselves in this time, to look at where we have disconnected. Like we were saying, that reconnection with source, remembering that connection. So I think this time being inside, we're noticing maybe where we're not so connected. And this is a time to see, well, how can I do that? And there's, I think, a lot of ways. I think it's a personal, whatever works for you. You might seek a yoga therapist or an Ayurvedic person and work with lifestyle practices. You might seek a psychotherapist or a meditation teacher, an eye rest practitioner, and do some of that more internal work. You might sign up for the gym finally and go to Zoom classes online. You know, it's like you were saying, sometimes it's just movement. So I think whatever invites you into a sense of belonging with your body and your senses initially, I think, is a place to start. At least that's where I like to start people. What do you enjoy? What do you love? What gets you in your body? What gets you in the present moment? Let's do that for a while. And then I can, you know, get them accessing to some other things that they might not just want to jump in and try initially. So I like to take the path of least resistance. So if you like to cook, then we'll do cooking stuff and like really get into food as medicine. Or I love oils, and I get people that love oils too. So we make custom blends, and it's really about like, what smells do you love? What supports you? You might not have time to meditate during the day if you have a house full of people or kids, but you have that roll on that you can take that moment, take a big breath in, feel your body, love the smell of jasmine or whatever it is we picked.
Yeah.
So that's, I go there. I start with very body-based, hands-on things, but that's just because that's what worked for me. So that's where I would go and kind of point to first. What about you?
Yeah, well, I get so many reminders that I'm talking to you. Yeah. Yeah. I think I would just add, I agree with everything you said, but I would just add consistency, right? And that, like Richard Miller, our teacher, our IRS teacher, says, is practice little and often. So I could have 10 roll-ons in my dresser, right? But if I don't use one with a little bit of intention every day, it doesn't do me any good.
Right.
And because I have a sort of that vata hastiness. So if I use it without intention, it still doesn't do me as much good as it could if I, like you said, took that deep breath and realized I am doing this for my nourishment and well-being. Or I can cook a meal and be blind the whole time to the colors and smells and textures, right? And then that does not nourish me at that deep level that it could have if I infused it with my presence. So it really is about being intentional, not all day, right? That's impossible. Being present, not all day, but little and often through the day, being intentional about grounding and resourcing ourselves. And that we're doing it to keep ourselves connected with ourselves so that we stay in our alignment, in our own groove, if you will, and not so easily swayed by the winds of the people around us or the times we're in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, it's been so fun talking to you, as always.
Yes, and thank you so much for talking about sacred conversations up front. And I just launch in and always sometimes forget, people are maybe new or just listening or not sure what a sacred conversation is. So we do it every 3 months. It circulates, so once a quarter.
Yep. So next month is our poetry and tea offering.
Yes.
Also free, complimentary. So only once a quarter do we offer a paid offering. The others are complimentary, and so it's poetry and tea in June.
Yes, and I will be cropping this little video and putting it on YouTube next week sometime. So if you liked it and wanted to share with somebody, or you think it's valuable I always listen to things a couple times or make notes the second time around, you can find it on Sacred Earth Retreats YouTube. Which
also, I just want to mention, has a donation button. So if you feel so inspired, we do appreciate that every time. So, yeah. Thanks for joining us live. Thanks for listening if you listen to it later, and we'll see you again.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, have a good weekend.
You too. Take care.